Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is James Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 11 wide receiver rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses thus far this season on average are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into Week 11. After which, I'll introduce my top 40 wide receiver rankings, talking about each individual player, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions, while also presenting statistics in order to justify these rankings as we approach Week 11. For those of you who are looking for a specific wide receiver, there are timestamps down in the description of the video. While you're down there, of course, subscribe to the channel, click the like button if you have not yet already. Tomorrow's video consists of quarterback and tight end rankings for Week 11. Friday's video is rest of season rankings for those of you who have trade deadlines this upcoming weekend. Of course, we have a Saturday afternoon live stream starting at 1 p.m. and a Sunday morning live stream starting at 7 a.m. So be sure to go ahead, subscribe if you have not yet already. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about matchups at the wide receiver position for Week 11. Thus far this season, from weeks 1 through 10, we have the Philadelphia Eagles at the top of the conversation in terms of allowing the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers in terms of receiving statistics isolated in a half PPR. That's receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Now, on the more disadvantageous side, via matchups, we have the New York Jets, who have certainly stopped opposing wide receivers. But like I did yesterday, I wanted to go ahead and just retune the overall matchups conversation by isolating a spectrum of time from weeks 5 through 10 in order to determine which secondaries and which defenses as of late haven't been playing well against the opposing wide receivers that they faced thus far this season. Therefore, we find that from weeks 5 through 10, in terms of receiving statistics isolated, the Philadelphia Eagles, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, New York Giants, Washington Commanders, still at the top of this conversation. These are the more up-to-date and readjusted rankings that we are, of course, going to be referring to over the course of today's episode, so keep that in mind. Of course, on the other end of this overall conversation, we have the more disadvantageous matchups. The New York Jets still at this conversation, the Denver Broncos, Las Vegas Raiders, Indianapolis Colts. A lot of shift that we have seen over the course of the last 5-6 games for these teams would certainly make a difference. All right, now that we've covered that, let's go ahead and transition into talking about my top 43 wide receiver rankings. And before we do so, a couple reminders. Rankings are subject to change. Between now and Sunday, I can 1000% guarantee you that my rankings are going to change. So be sure to show up on Sunday morning if you have any questions. Also, if you guys want to get my up-to-date rankings going into Sunday morning, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match up to $100, but you'll get my rankings sent to you from my email directly to yours every single Sunday for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, by tier, flex rankings, half PPR, full PPR, all-encompassing rankings for each individual week for the remainder of the season. So if you guys are interested, be sure to take advantage of the opportunity. Make sure to check out the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on the map and your current location. Of course, draft responsibly via Underdog Fantasy. Follow via the pick'ems. I'll be putting together a couple pick'em slips at the end of tomorrow's video. Of course, for the Thursday night matchup between the Cincinnati Bengals and Baltimore Ravens. And if you're a new customer and you sign up today before tomorrow's game, you could take advantage of 0.5 total yards from Joe Burrow. Thank you very much for all the support and using code Andrew. All right, let's talk about the wide receiver position, beginning with our number one. It has to be CeeDee Lamb. CeeDee Lamb, what he's been able to accomplish in the last 3 weeks is unbelievable. Of course, coming off a 34-point fantasy performance in a half PPR scoring format. But besides that, if you go ahead and just look at the last 3 weeks, weeks 8 through 10, in which he's performed, he has had 44 targets, 34 receptions, 500 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, and 91.6 fantasy points in just the last 3 games alone in a half PPR scoring format. Now, if you go ahead and compare that to weeks 1 through 6 of the season, from weeks 1 through 6, he had less targets, just as many receptions, less receiving yards, less receiving touchdowns, and less fantasy points. In the last 3 games, he's been able to accomplish so much, and I don't believe they're stopping anytime soon. As long as Tony Pollard isn't the one rushing in touchdowns, which of course, majority of that is the offensive line's fault. If you guys have actually watched the film, I've looked at the all-22 end zone film, and the offensive line is disgusting, but nonetheless, as long as they continue to hand the ball off to guys like CeeDee Lamb down in the end zone, of course, getting rushing touchdowns tacked on to his overall performances with an end around, averaging nearly 15 targets per game over the last 3 weeks. Of course, taking on the Carolina Panthers, I know that they'll have the potential of J.C. Horn returning, but it doesn't bother me. I have a lot of confidence in CeeDee Lamb once again. Moving on to our number 2, we have Tyreek Hill, the wide receiver that is currently on pace to achieve over 2,000 receiving yards this season. Thus far, he is on pace for 2,032 yards. Hopefully, he'll be able to accomplish that in his overall efforts. This upcoming week, he'll obviously have an advantage taking on the defense of the Las Vegas Raiders. Even though they haven't given up much in terms of their secondary, oftentimes what teams have done to the Las Vegas Raiders has been just running the ball. They run the ball in the second half because they've mounted a lead over the course of the season, and that's pretty much been the case. So I won't let the matchup fool me in this circumstance. Of course, we're firing up Tyreek Hill, a guy that thus far this season in home games, he has gotten himself a minimum of 110 receiving yards per game and 1 touchdown per game. In the last 4 contests he's played at home. He plays at home this week against Las Vegas. Of course, an automatic play. Moving on to our number 3, we have A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown's been incredible. From weeks 3 through 9, he's been averaging 11 targets, 8 receptions, 128 receiving yards per game, and 0.86 receiving touchdowns per game, all for 21.96 fantasy points per game since week 3. He takes on the Kansas City Chiefs this week. Of course, the last time we saw these two teams take it on, it was in the Super Bowl. In that game, A.J. Brown, 6 catches for 96 yards and a receiving touchdown, over 18 fantasy points and a half PPR scoring format. I'm hoping that this game lives up to the hype. Considering how, poorly this Philadelphia Eagles secondary has played, we're hoping for a shootout here between these two teams. And of course, the absence of Dallas Goedert is only going to help give A.J. Brown more opportunity within the receiving game. Moving on to our number 4, we have Ja'Marr Chase. There's already been a confirmation from earlier this morning that T. Higgins will not be playing on Thursday. Not really much of a surprise there. In the last 3 games from 2023 and 2022, in which Ja'Marr Chase has played without T. Higgins in the lineup, he has scored 44.7, 20.9, and 23.5 fantasy points. In those 3 games, a total of 40 targets. Earlier this season, against the Baltimore Ravens in week 2, of course, Joe Burrow was still injured. Ja'Marr Chase didn't have himself a great overall performance, but T. Higgins did. T. Higgins in that game, 8 catches on 12 targets for 89 and 2 touchdowns, 25 fantasy points. Going into this week, if he's only going to accumulate all those opportunities, of course, Ja'Marr Chase has a very high upside of potential and hopefully will ball out on Thursday Night Football. Moving on to our number 5, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown. He seems like he's always open. That's what it feels like. Every time I watch this team play, they just continue to find Amon-Ra St. Brown open in the middle of the field, and he's running for 40-plus yards. In 6 of the last 7 games he has played, he's been able to surpass 100-plus receiving yards. It is unbelievable what he's been able to accomplish thus far this season. They take on the Chicago Bears, who have played extremely well in terms of stopping the run since week 5, and as long as that's going to continue to be the case, if in fact we see any struggles from the Detroit Lions offensive line and or running game, they're going to, of course, pass the ball at a consistent rate in the direction of their number 1, Amon-Ra St. Brown, who continues to deliver incredible performances, whether it's 100 plus receiving yards or scoring a touchdown, or as of late, both continues to carry our fantasy teams. Moving on to our number 6, Keenan Allen. I'll be totally honest, I had Keenan Allen a little bit slightly higher, but due to the uncertainty to his shoulder injury, I heard earlier today from Brandon Staley, the head coach of the Los Angeles Chargers, he was quoted to have said, "I'm hoping that Keenan Allen plays on Sunday." He didn't have much confidence in that overall statement. I know he's trying to be discreet and trying to obviously, keep all the medical information private in that overall circumstance, but I am a little bit worried about it. He did return in Sunday's game against the Detroit Lions with that injury in the 4th quarter. He did return. He scored a touchdown, kept the game close. He had himself, 11 receptions, 175 and 2 touchdowns. We talked about it last week in regards to Keenan Allen still having a lot of room left in terms of scoring touchdowns, considering, he usually scores about 4 to 8 per season. He scored 6 thus far, so he's got a couple more touchdown games ahead of him, to say the very least. Nonetheless, this upcoming week, they take on the Green Bay Packers. The matchup is incredible, considering last week, Jair Alexander didn't play. He's dealing with an injury. Stokes is on injured reserve. Savage is on injured reserve. Rasul Douglas was traded away to the Buffalo Bills. They have gotten themselves a lot of injuries and a lot of missing players. Keyshawn Nixon, who is the primary slot cornerback of this team, has given up the 7th most receptions and 10th most receiving yards to opposing slot receiving options thus far this season. Keenan Allen should have a dominant performance once again. Moving on to our 8 tier, beginning with our number 7, we have Stefon Diggs. The lack of opportunity that Stefon Diggs had on Monday Night Football against the Denver Broncos was quite ridiculous. 5 targets for an elite wide receiver of his, caliber it's unacceptable. And obviously, they've changed the offensive coordinator. Joe Brady will be taking over the play calling going forward. And hopefully that's going to provide more of an emphasis in terms of getting the ball in the direction of Stefon Diggs. This week, they take on the toughest matchup at the wide receiver position since week 5, only allowing 10 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers throughout that span of time. They take on the New York Jets. The Jets in week 1, Stefon Diggs had himself 13 targets, 10 catches, 102, and a touchdown for 21.2 fantasy points. Sauce Gardner isn't going to shadow him. That's not how their defense works. And hopefully Stefon Diggs will have himself an upside performance considering the change of the offensive coordinator and more of an emphasis in getting their best player the ball on a consistent rate. Moving on to our number 8, we have Justin Jefferson, the thumbnail of today's episode. I'm not 100% certain what kind of an offense we're going to see, but if you guys remember what Justin Jefferson was getting in the first quarter of the season, weeks 1 through 4, 11 targets per game, nearly 12, 8.3 receptions per game, 136 receiving yards per game, and was scoring a touchdown 3 out of every 4 games, averaging 21.7 fantasy points per game and a half PPR scoring format. Throughout that span of time, of course, the defense for the Minnesota Vikings couldn't hold, and they were throwing the ball 44 to 50 times per game through weeks 1 through 3. Now, in comparison to what we've seen as of late from the Minnesota Vikings offense, who from weeks 9 and 10, their quarterbacks have thrown a total of, 35 passing attempts per game on average. It's a pretty big difference there in terms of total opportunity for these receiving options. So if we're going to see less opportunity go in the direction of Justin Jefferson, which I'm hoping is not going to be the case, but if in fact we do, then he will still have to kind of assimilate within this offense and get used to the overall chemistry with Josh Dobbs. I think that Justin Jefferson is certainly a talented enough wide receiver that it doesn't matter who's throwing him the ball. It's just a matter of, can Josh Dobbs elevate himself to feeding a TJ Hawkinson, a Justin Jefferson, and a Jordan Addison all within one singular game. Either way, of course, he's an automatic start, as we know, taking on the Denver Broncos. Moving on to our number 9, we have Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp, with Matthew Stafford returning, he did get himself a full participation of practice earlier today. We're very confident with the return there, taking on the Seattle Seahawks this week. The reason why we've been a little bit kind of worried as to whether or not Matthew Stafford will be a full return is because, of course, they signed Carson Wentz, but luckily, we got ourselves that information this morning. In the last 3 games that Cooper Kupp has played, he has had himself less than 10 fantasy points in each of those 3 contests. Of course, one of those games in which Matthew Stafford wasn't there. The other one, Matthew Stafford left at halftime, and the other one was a Puka Nacua masterpiece against the Pittsburgh Steelers. But nonetheless, very seldom, as of the last couple of seasons, have we ever seen Matthew Stafford with Cooper Kupp perform less than 10 fantasy points unless he was injured within those games. Going into this week, again, the Seattle Seahawks secondary has been playing very well. They're only allowing 20.72 fantasy points per game since week 5. Top 5 in terms of the toughest matchups going into the given week. But going back to week 1, when the Rams took on the Seattle Seahawks without Cooper Kupp in the lineup, Puka Nacua, 15 targets, 10 catches, 119. So if in fact we're going to see that kind of a workload potentially in the direction of Cooper Kupp, should have himself a solid performance. Moving on to our number 10 to begin the B tier. As of late, Jaylen Waddle has found himself injured on multiple occasions. Week 7 and 9 only played 45% and 54% of the overall offensive snaps, which is quite underwhelming. But in the 3 other healthy games that he has played since week 5, he's been averaging 10.3 targets, 6.3 receptions, 69 receiving yards, 1 receiving touchdown per game, and 16.07 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. When he's healthy and on the field for this offense, he's putting up over 16 fantasy points per game over the course of the last 5 contests. So as long as we get another healthy week coming off of the bye, hopefully he's ready to go, taking on the Las Vegas Raiders with so much effort going in the direction of trying to stop Tyreek Hill. Of course, it's only going to open up more and more opportunity for Jaylen Waddle this week. Moving on to our number 11, we have Mike Evans. Mike Evans, weeks 1 through 10, in healthy games that he has played, averaging 8.4 targets, 5 receptions per game, 87 receiving yards, scoring a touchdown 3 out of every 4 games he has played, and averaging 15.71 fantasy points per game. In week 9, unfortunately had himself a touchdown that was pretty much called back. It was a 50-yard touchdown down the field, 53 yards to be exact. Unfortunately, he was down at the 1-yard line against the Houston Texans. Could have had himself another touchdown, but thus far this season, he has scored 6 touchdowns in the 8 healthy games that he has participated in. Easily should be an automatic start. I understand that this is a tough matchup taking on the San Francisco 49ers, especially how well they played against the Jacksonville Jaguars. But I do anticipate that, Mike Evans is going to get his elite volume of opportunity and hopefully can find himself in the end zone despite the difficult matchup. Moving on to our number 12, we have Tank Dell. I mean, at this current moment in time, we kind of have to consider him within this conversation. When you're associated with the quarterback that leads the National Football League in passing yardage, of course, you're going to elevate your overall performance. Thus far this season, in games in which we have seen Tank Dell only get himself 4 or fewer targets, that's week 1, 4, 5, and 8. He's averaging 3.8 targets per game, 2.5 receptions, 31 receiving yards, and 4.93 fantasy points per game. And I say this because as of late, we have seen him get far more opportunity. And in games in which he has had 7 or more targets, weeks 2, 3, 9, and 10, averaging 10.5 targets per game, 6 receptions, 97 receiving yards, 1.25 receiving touchdowns per game, and 20.55 fantasy points per game, coming off of a performance last week against Cincinnati in which he had 14 total targets. That volume of opportunity, even in the return of Nico Collins, is still going to stay within that overall kind of 10-plus range. I'm expecting Tank Dell to continue his streak of success going into week 11. Moving on to our number 13, we have Davante Adams. After the Sunday Night Football game, the head coach of the Raiders, Antonio Pierce, came out and said, I know that I have an elite wide receiver. I'm not stupid. I'm going to get him the ball. And luckily, they went ahead and demonstrated that. 13 targets, 6 catches for 86 yards. Still an underwhelming performance overall with only 11.6 fantasy points, but we'll take it in this overall circumstance. I think there may be a chance in which the Miami Dolphins boat race the Las Vegas Raiders, and if that does in fact take place, we'll have Davante Adams Aiden O'Connell throwing the ball for majority of the second half. And if that's going to go ahead and come to fruition, of course, there's going to be a lot of opportunity for Davante Adams to have himself an upside fantasy performance within the given week. We're hoping that he can have himself that kind of high opportunity every single time out. It's just tough to say. This defense for the Miami Dolphins, in terms of their secondary, they have Jalen Ramsey back coming off of the bye week. It's going to be a competitive matchup there, but I give the advantage in the direction of Davante Adams. Moving on to our number 14, to begin the C tier, we have DK Metcalf. I mentioned it last week in regards to, hey, we want to be trading for DK Metcalf. Because the rest of season strength of schedule for the Seattle Seahawks looks incredible. And I guess that kind of applies to, Tyler Lockett and Jaxon Smith-Njigba. But overall, 12 targets, 7 catches, 98 receiving yards. We love to see it. Earlier this season in week 1 against the LA Rams, DK Metcalf did not have a single target within that game in the second half, yet he put up over 12 fantasy points. We're going to hope that he can go ahead and have himself another successful performance, but hopefully more consistency, especially considering as of late, he's been able to get himself 9 or more targets in 3 of the last 4 games. If the target opportunity is going to be there within this offense, of course, he's going to have himself a lot of potential for upside. As of late, when we compare the 2023 campaign of DK Metcalf to his 2022 year, 2022 had a 64% catch rate. Thus far this season only has a 56% catch rate. He's getting a lot of target opportunity, but he's often not able to go ahead and elevate his overall performance by catching majority of them, mainly because Geno Smith just hasn't been great. But luckily, DK Metcalf has an advantageous matchup this week, taking on the LA Rams. Should be an exciting game. Moving on to our number 15, we have DeVonta Smith. The primary reason I have DeVonta Smith in this overall position, it has to do with the fact that unfortunately, Dallas Goedert is not going to be available and active within the lineup. Obviously, had an injury a couple weeks back, is going to be out this week. In weeks 11 through 15 of the 2022 season, in which Dallas Goedert was missing, in those games, DeVonta Smith with Jalen Hurts was averaging 8.4 targets, 5.0 receptions, 84 receiving yards per game, 0.4 receiving touchdowns per game. So 2 out of every 5 games he was scoring a touchdown, and 13.3 fantasy points per game and a half PPR scoring from that. They take on the Kansas City Chiefs in the Super Bowl. We saw DeVonta Smith ball out, 7 catches for 100 yards. He scored a touchdown in each of the last 2 games he has played. And in the absence of Dallas Goedert, there should be more opportunity going in his direction in a high-scoring shootout. Moving on to our number 16, we have Puka Nacua. Puka Nacua should, of course, see himself a high volume of opportunity, especially because they take on the Seattle Seahawks. And honestly, their running game may not be at the highest level in comparison to where it was week 1. In week 1, they obviously ran the ball like 37 times against the Seattle Seahawks. I'm not expecting us to get into a position as such going into this week. So we may experience a more pass-happy effort from the Los Angeles Rams offense. With Matthew Stafford practicing fully earlier today, gives me more confidence in week 1 against the Seattle Seahawks. Puka Nacua, 15 targets, 10 catches, 119. I don't think he'll be able to, achieve those kind of numbers once again, but I believe the volume of opportunity that will be sent in his direction as the number 2 wide receiver of this offense, and at times, in some, circumstances, sometimes appears as the number 1 of this offense. If we go back to that Pittsburgh Steelers game, of course, he should be a fantastic play and a solid wide receiver 2 option. Moving on to our number 17, we have Brandin Aiyuk. Brandin Aiyuk and the boys take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. If, in fact, this San Francisco 49ers offense plays as well as they did on Sunday against the Jacksonville Jaguars for the remainder of the season, they should go undefeated going into the playoffs. But for fantasy purposes, that doesn't help Brandin Aiyuk. He's coming off of a week in which he had 3 targets, 3 catches, 55 yards and a touchdown. And Brock Purdy only threw the ball 25 times against the Jacksonville Jaguars, which is concerning. Luckily, this week they take on the Buccaneers. That's the second best matchup at the position since week 5, allowing nearly 38 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We're hoping for an upside performance here from Brandin Aiyuk. We'll have to wait and see. We know that Brandin Ayuk's touchdown that he scored, according to Kyle Shanahan, that was the worst throw that Brock Purdy has ever had since being a San Francisco 49er. We're just going to hope that he doesn't, get scared of throwing those passes, because as long as it leads to fantasy points, we'll take it. Moving on to the 18 to close out the C tier, we have Tyler Lockett. This offense is obviously taking a step forward, and with the remaining games that they have, all being either shootouts or advantageous matchups in terms of the secondary coverages that they're playing against, Tyler Lockett should continue to have value. On Sunday, I moved him up significantly in my rankings in comparison to where I had him last Wednesday. So again, rankings are subject to change. Keep that in mind. But going into this week against the LA Rams, I look back at the week 1 performance. In that game, literally the first 2 passing attempts from Geno Smith went in the direction of Tyler Lockett. He had 2 receptions on the first drive. For the remainder of the game, he didn't have a single reception. So that was pretty much a fluke performance. And as of late, we have seen far more utilization of Tyler Lockett within this offense that has gotten himself to a consistent fantasy, upside performance. In the last 3 consecutive games, over 8 targets in those 3 games. In the last 5 games he has played in which he has had 8 or more targets, he's averaging 15.26 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. The Rams are middle of the pack in terms of their overall defense. They're allowing nearly 27 fantasy points per game in a half PPR to opposing wide receivers since week 5. Should be an awesome matchup here for Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, and of course, Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Moving on to our number 19, we have Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson, unfortunately, probably will never score a touchdown for the remainder of the season. This offense for the New York Jets hasn't scored an offensive touchdown in quite some time. But at least we continue to see opportunities sent in the direction of Garrett Wilson. From weeks 4 through 10, he's averaging 12.2 targets, 7.2 receptions, 80 receiving yards, and 11.3 fantasy points per game. He's been able to achieve over 12 plus targets in 5 of the last 6 games he has played, and 80 plus receiving yards in each of the last 4 games he has played. As long as he's going to get himself 7 overall receptions, so 3.5 fantasy points there in a half PPR, 80 receiving yards. Again, 11.5 fantasy points is a safe play, and that's why he, is pretty much sitting here at wide receiver 19 for this week. Moving on to our number 20, we have Adam Thielen. So there was a little bit of whispers going around the Carolina Panthers organization that perhaps Frank Reich, the head coach and former play caller of this offense, was going to take over the job once again. And the reason why that was pretty much kind of brought into the conversation was because since week 8, since the actual offensive coordinator took over the play calling and took it away from Frank Reich, we have seen Adam Thielen only put up 11.2, 5.4, and 7.2 fantasy points. The only shining light of this offense, which was Adam Thielen, pretty much got diminished in the changing of the overall offensive play calling. So going forward, we're hoping that Frank Reich is going to get Adam Thielen back into the conversation of being a 15 to 20 point wide receiver. But until we can see it, he's a solid wide receiver 2 option because, of course, touchdown upside is very difficult to predict in those circumstances. But luckily, they do take on the Dallas Cowboys in the idea that, of course, this is going to be a negative matchup, negative game script, in which, of course, they'll be throwing for majority of the second half and hopefully looking in the direction, once again, of Adam Thielen. Moving on to our number 21, we have Christian Kirk. He continues the ball out. In weeks 1 and 8, he played less than 70% of the overall snaps. Outside of those games in which he put up, 1.4 fantasy points and 6.6, again, when he doesn't play much, he doesn't score very many points. But in the other games in which he's played over 70% of the offensive snaps this season, these 7 other games, averaging 9 targets, 6.3 receptions, 81 receiving yards, 0.43 receiving touchdowns, and 13.35 fantasy points per game. They do take on the Tennessee Titans. That defense, in terms of their secondary, has not played well all season, have often been a passing funnel. And considering we really can't trust any other receiving options within this offense, Christian Kirk continues to be the dominant wide receiver of the Jacksonville Jaguars attack. Moving on to my number 22, we have Terry McLaurin. Terry McLaurin, in his 8 career games against the New York Giants, is averaging 15.00 fantasy points per game. He has never scored less than 10 fantasy points in his career against the New York Giants. Going back to his rookie year, the Washington Commanders, amongst all teams in the National Football League this season, have the highest pass rate, a 68.7% pass rate, a ridiculous number. But as long as they continue to throw the ball, and there's a potential in which Adoree Jackson, the primary number 1 cornerback of the New York Giants, who missed last week, if he in fact is going to miss once again this week, it's only going to open up more opportunity for Terry McLaurin to have himself an incredible overall performance within the given week. Moving on to our number 23, we have Courtland Sutton. Does he keep balling out or what? What Courtland Sutton has accomplished this season, if you guys remember 2022 offseason, going into the 2022 season, I had, Courtland Sutton ranked as like a top 16 overall wide receiver. And not by accident, because I assumed in association with Russell Wilson, he would see himself a lot of opportunity and hopefully a lot of touchdowns, just like DK Metcalf or Tyler Lockett did when, of course, Russell Wilson was with the Seattle Seahawks. But in 2022, that entire offense was a mess. But in 2023, this Courtland Sutton that I anticipated from last season has really come to fruition. This man has scored 7 touchdowns in the last 9 games he has played. He has the 9th most red zone targets amongst all receiving options this season, with 12 targets that have led to those 7 overall red zone touchdowns. He has a 21% target share this season, but in the last 3 games in which they've been on a winning streak, in which they've beat the Kansas City Chiefs and, of course, the Buffalo Bills as of late, he has had a 26% target share. The opportunities are there. The touchdowns are there. The yardage is only going to compile. Even though they do take on a difficult matchup against the Minnesota Vikings, my expectation is another solid week here from Courtland Sutton. Moving on to our number 24, we have Deebo Samuel. I thought about keeping Deebo Samuel within the D tier, but again, it is very difficult to assume that this offense is going to get him that kind of rushing opportunity every single week, in which he scored a rushing touchdown with an end around for 23 yards and obviously made his entire fantasy performance. Outside of that overall rushing touchdown, only had 4 targets, 4 receptions, 30 receiving yards, an underwhelming performance to say the least, especially considering how advantageous the matchup was. Going into this weekend's matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, it is the second best matchup at the position. We're hoping for more opportunity going in the direction of Deebo Samuel. He's still a top 24 wide receiver. In my mind, an automatic start going into this given week. I just wanted to be a little bit wary with him and kind of move him into a lower tier in case you prefer one of these other options that I'm going to follow up with. Moving on to 125, we have DJ Moore. I've mentioned it in weeks past. From weeks 2 through 5 with Justin Fields as a starting quarterback. In all 4 of those games, DJ Moore has scored over 10 fantasy points and a half PPR. In 3 of those 4 games, surpassing 100 plus receiving yards. Since week 7, with Tyson Bagent as a starting quarterback, we have only seen DJ Moore averaging, 5 receptions per game, 53 receiving yards per game, 0 touchdowns, and 7.3 fantasy points per game. There's been a huge difference there with Justin Fields coming back, taking on the Detroit Lions, probably going to have to pass the ball for the entirety of that game. DJ Moore is expected to have himself a big performance here. Hopefully, he'll be better than number 25. I'm expecting him to be, but at this current moment in time, we have to wait and see just exactly how that thumb injury has impacted Justin Fields' throwing potential. If, in fact, it does negatively impact him, I just don't want to go ahead and immediately throw out DJ Moore into the conversation blindly in case he goes ahead and puts up a dud performance because of the lack of production from Justin Fields and potential accuracy. My number 26 for this week is Marquise Hollywood Brown. I understand that he had a very underwhelming performance of 1 catch on 4 targets for 28 yards, but he played 100% of the offensive snaps in Sunday's game against the Atlanta Falcons. We got to remember, going back to 2022, to begin the year, weeks 1 through 6, he was averaging nearly 15 fantasy points per game while averaging nearly 11 targets per game within that offense. A 4-target game with Kyler Murray, in my opinion, is just something that we're just going to brush off the shoulder, and we're going to continue with the idea that, yes, they're going to get the ball in Hollywood Brown's direction on a consistent basis, especially considering thus far this season, quarterbacks not named Kyler Murray have averaged targeting Marquise Hollywood Brown nearly 9 times per game. So he's going to get himself incorporation within this offense. They do take on the Houston Texans. It is an advantageous matchup, especially considering how many injuries they have in their secondary. Moving on to our number 27, we have Nico Collins. Speaking of injuries and the Houston Texans, Nico Collins said earlier today that he will in fact be playing in week 11, which is of course promising. He is still a top 2 receiving option within this offense. Him and Tank Dell are the number 1 and number 2 option. Of course, Noah Brown and of course Robert Woods can deal with that number 3-4 kind of conversation. But going forward, as long as you're associated with a quarterback that leads the National Football League in passing yardage, I'm assuming that Nico Collins could very easily show up, get himself 10 plus targets every single game, and in a high scoring event in which they're throwing the ball for the majority of the time, of course, put together a solid performance as a wide receiver 3 with upside, assuming he finds the end zone. Moving on to our number 28, we have Chris Godwin. Chris Godwin is in a position taking on the San Francisco 49ers where hopefully he is going to see himself a high volume of overall targets and hopefully plays in the slot position a little bit more. Chris Godwin this season, in comparison to seasons past with Tom Brady, is playing far less within the slot position, playing far more out wide, which has certainly diminished his overall potential for fantasy purposes. But if you look back to last week, the damage that Christian Kirk did against the San Francisco 49ers, primarily because the 49ers, they changed their primary slot nickel cornerback from Isaiah Oliver to Lenore. Lenore got torched. He allowed 7 targets, 7 catches for 107 in the slot position against Christian Kirk. So my expectation going into this week is hopefully they'll watch the film. They'll utilize Chris Godwin far more within the slot position, and Baker Mayfield will consistently look in his direction in a negative game script. Moving on to our number 29, we have DeAndre Hopkins. Unfortunately, DeAndre Hopkins is dealing with an underwhelming, quarterback for another consecutive game. He's at the mercy of these quarterbacks. Will Levis was I think he was 19 for 39 passing on Sunday, a 48% passing completion percentage. We just got to hope that the matchup itself, the 7th best at the position since week 5, allowing over 31 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and the familiarity that, of course, DeAndre Hopkins has with the Jacksonville Jaguars, considering all his time with the Houston Texans throughout his career. We're hoping that he can see himself far more opportunity, and the opportunities that he does receive are accurate, on point, and hopefully down in the red zone. Moving on to our number 30, we have Rashee Rice. It is the best matchup at the position. The Eagles are allowing nearly 40 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And when we talk about the most reliable wide receiver for the Kansas City Chiefs, by far and away, it's Rashee Rice. Continues to put up consistent performances since week 5 through 9. He's averaging 10.26 fantasy points per game and a half PPR, and has been the number 18 overall wide receiver in terms of fantasy points per game on average throughout that span of time. Of course, an automatic start within the given week. Moving on to our number 31, we have Tyler Boyd taking on the Baltimore Ravens on Thursday Night Football. Tyler Boyd, of course, I'm expecting to have himself a solid performance, especially considering he's coming off of a week of 12 targets 8 catches, 117. 12 targets is the most that Tyler Boyd has seen since week 7 of 2020, when Jamar Chase wasn't even on roster. We already know that Higgins and Yossi are going to be out for the wide receiver position, so it'll just be Chase, Irwin, and of course, Tyler Boyd, who hopefully should have himself a solid performance and a pretty high overall target share within the overall offense. My number 32 for this week on the other side of this conversation is Zay Flowers taking on the Cincinnati Bengals. Thursday Night Football. Again, Zay Flowers has been quite inconsistent, ebbs and flows throughout the entire season. Some games he gets a lot of opportunity, some he doesn't. And we're just going to have to deal with that. Last week, scoring 9.8 fantasy points was actually higher than where I had him projected within the week. 5 catches for 73, we'll take that this week. If in fact we can get 10 plus fantasy points within this overall contest in a game in which, of course, the offensive line will be missing potentially not only their left tackle, but right tackle. If the running game isn't as efficient as it typically is, hopefully it'll lead to Lamar Jackson throwing the ball 4 more often within the given week. We know that Lamar Jackson only had 13 completed passes on Sunday's game against Cleveland, so we're hoping for that to get a far higher number so that we can get more utilization out of a guy like Zay Flowers. Moving on to our number 33, we have Diontae Johnson. Diontae Johnson is at the mercy of Kenny Pickett, and unfortunately Sunday's game, Kenny Pickett in this offense, they ran the ball for the entirety of the game. A lot of success from Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren. I know that many of you guys commented yesterday saying that Jaylen Warren was named the starter. If you go look at the context of what Mike Tomlin said in the post-game interview, it was more of a symbol of, hey, he's the starter rather than, he's going to be the starter for the remainder of the season. Just go watch the presser and you'll get an understanding of that. Either way, as of late, yes, from weeks 7 through 9, Diontae Johnson was getting himself a 35% target share within this offense and a minimum of 79 receiving yards per game. Unfortunately, only had 1 reception for 17 yards on 4 targets last week, mainly because Kenny Pickett only had 14 completions and 23 total passing attempts in a game in which they won on the ground. Hopefully this week against the Cleveland Browns, we'll see far more opportunity. It is a very difficult matchup. If Denzel Ward is going to be missing the primary number 1 cornerback, because I know he left the game on Sunday early due to an injury against the Baltimore Ravens, if he's not going to be active, it could bode very well for Diontae Johnson. Otherwise, could be a very difficult matchup at the end of the day. Moving on to our number 34, we have Noah Brown. I know that earlier today we got information that Noah Brown did not practice on Wednesday, but if in fact he does play, I do anticipate that Nico Collins and Tank Dell will be the number 1 and number 2 wide receiver in the future of this team. While currently Noah Brown has had himself back-to-back weeks of over 150 receiving yards per game, he also has to compete with Robert Woods for that number 3 wide receiver position. And the reason why that's the case is because Robert Woods is a captain on this team. They're not going to put a C on his chest and not, pretty much roll him out there. So if in fact we see less opportunity from Noah Brown going forward, I won't be surprised, especially if in fact that injury that he's dealing with, which forced him to miss Wednesday's practice, is going to continue to affect him. Even in the 9th best matchup of the week, taking on the Arizona Cardinals, it could be a tough week. We'll have to keep that monitored as the week progresses. Moving on, we have Jordan Addison. So here's the thing about Jordan Addison. With Justin Jefferson back and the fact that TJ Hawkinson has by far and away been the favorite target of, Joshua Dobbs, this leads to Jordan Addison potentially seeing far less target opportunities. But I will put it this way. Once you have Justin Jefferson in the game, TJ Hawkinson obviously dominating the middle of the field, it's going to pull less pressure off of Jordan Addison to make consistent plays within this offense. And if he's taking on number 2 cornerbacks in comparison to what he has seen over the course of the last couple of weeks without Justin Jefferson, I think this could end up benefiting him in the long run. Taking on Denver this week, it is a tough matchup within that secondary, but nonetheless, just keep in mind, this could end up being something that helps him or hurts him. Time will tell whether or not Joshua Dobbs is going to be able to feature 3 receiving options within one singular offense. Moving on to our number 36, we have Romeo Doubs and Jayden Reed. I wanted to mention both these options primarily because both these guys are coming off of a week in which they had a touchdown over 10 fantasy points. In fact, in 3 of the last 4 games, both Romeo Doubs and Jayden Reed have both been able to surpass 9.5 fantasy points. As long as these guys continue to score garbage touchdowns in the second half of games, mainly because they are one of the worst offenses in the first half of games, they take on the Chargers, they'll be in a negative game script to say the very least. The only game in which these 2 wide receivers weren't able to surpass 9.5 fantasy points over the course of the last 4 games was against the Rams, in which they scored early, they ran the ball often, and of course didn't really have to throw the ball in the second half. So going into this week against the Los Angeles Chargers, we know that's a great matchup. I'm expecting both these guys to be solid options within their top 36 capacity. Moving on to our number 38, Gabe Davis. In any given week, Gabe Davis could score. We're going to hope that Ken Dorsey's removal and the change of offensive coordinator could give him more opportunity, but I think this may be a week in which they feature Stefon Diggs more so that they stop hearing him complain and or his brother complain on Twitter. Nonetheless, Obviously, we know that Gabriel Davis is super touchdown dependent. If he doesn't score a touchdown, it could be tough, especially going up against the New York Jets, which in week 1, Gabe Davis didn't have a great overall time. Moving on to our number 39, we have Jahan Dotson. Even though he is coming off a 0.00 point performance for fantasy in week 10, he is still the number 27 overall wide receiver in terms of fantasy points per game since week 7. As long as the opportunity gets back on track, taking on the New York Giants, Terry McLaurin pulling a lot of pressure, the running game, of course, being highly effective, the assumption is that Jahan Dotson should hopefully get back on track as the number 2 receiving option of this offense. Our number 40 is Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Of course, since week 7, he's been incredible. He's been the number 29 overall wide receiver throughout that span of time in terms of fantasy points per game on average, scoring 9+ fantasy points in 3 of the last 4 games. As long as he's going to continue to be in that conversation, fantastic, an advantageous matchup. The only reason that JSN doesn't play more snaps or gets more, total targets within a given week has to do with Jake Bobo's 20 to 30% of overall snap shares that he is stealing from him every single game. Moving on to the number 41 conversation with Brandin Cooks. This is a game in which the Carolina Panthers are probably going to give up a lot of fantasy points. If in fact the Dallas Cowboys offense, similar to what they did to the LA Rams and potentially to the Philadelphia Eagles secondary and most recently to the New York Giants, if they're going to score a boatload of points within the passing game and Dak Prescott is only going to continue to air it out, we can hope that Brandin Cooks, after CeeDee Lamb is tired of catching the ball and scoring points on a consistent basis, hopefully Brandin Cooks can continue to be that number 2 option within this offense going forward. Getting 10 targets, 9 catches for 173 and a touchdown is no joke. Hopefully they'll continue to go back to that well this week. Moving on to the final couple wide receivers I wanted to mention, Jakobi Meyers. Again, as long as we're going to be in a conversation where unfortunately Jakobi Meyers is subject to the idea that, this quarterback play isn't going to elevate him, isn't going to get him enough targets on a per game basis. They're obviously going to prefer to get to the ball in the direction of Davante Adams to keep him satisfied. As long as that's going to be the case, even in a negative game script, it is sketchy to play Jakobi Meyers, but I do want to mention him just in case this game becomes truly a game in which they're only throwing for 3+ quarters. If in fact the Miami Dolphins boat race them out the blocks in the first quarter with the track team that they have. But I also wanted to mention my number 43, Amari Cooper. Earlier today, I had an entire spiel that in the last 4 games with Deshaun Watson at the quarterback position, he's averaging 17.2 fantasy points per game, over 110 receiving yards per game, 6+ catches, a half a touchdown per game. I was excited to mention that his receiving counts with Deshaun Watson in the last 4 healthy games, 90, 116, 139, 98. Great, but unfortunately, Deshaun Watson's season-ending injury. With Dorian Thompson-Robinson expected to be the starting quarterback for the remainder of the season, it doesn't give me much hope. We know that in the 2 games in which, of course, Amari Cooper played with PJ Walker, he had 89+ receiving yards in 2 of those contests, but it isn't as consistent as it typically is. We're going to have to wait and see what DTR has in store for us. I'm not expecting much, therefore I have Amari Cooper at 43. Okay, guys, thank you everybody for watching. That's going to conclude today's episode. I hope you appreciate all of the overall context, information, statistics over the course of today's video. Tomorrow, I'll return with quarterback and tight end rankings. Friday, rest of season rankings for all 4 primary positions so that you can determine who you're trading for in the coming days. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you have not yet already, of course, subscribe, click the like button down below, comment down below, and last but definitely not least, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy to get my up-to-date rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season using code Andrew and making a first-time deposit just once, $10 minimum. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.